just look at a map of North America and kind of wonder, why? Why is that huge chunk of land up north its own country and not just, more of the United States? Today, they're famously best buddies, but that friendly border we see now, well, it was built on a history of some pretty serious and often forgotten conflict. So let's get into the surprising story of why these two countries are separate.
Right. So why isn't Canada part of the US? It sounds like a pretty simple question, doesn't it? But the answer, whoa, it is anything but simple. We're talking revolutions, huge cultural clashes, and a bunch of massive military gambles that honestly could have redrawn the entire continent. And here it is, the big twist they don't always put in the textbooks. The United States didn't just politely ask Canada to join the Union. Oh no, it tried to take Canada by force, multiple times. And you know what? It failed, spectacularly, every single time. So this isn't some story about a peaceful mutual parting of ways. It's a story of failed conquest.
Okay, so our story kicks off way back during the American Revolution. The American colonies are breaking away from Great Britain and they figure, hey, why don't we get our northern neighbors in on this? It seemed like a total no-brainer at the time, but it turned out to be America's first huge miscalculation about Canada.
And man, did things go south for the Americans, like almost immediately. In 1775, they sent a nice little letter, an invitation to join the cause. When Quebec said no thanks, the Americans didn't even pause. They launched a full-on invasion. But by the very next year, after a totally brutal winter, their army was shattered and running back home. It was a complete and total failure.
So why the snub? Why'd they say no? Well, it really all comes down to something called the Quebec Act. See, Britain had just given the French Canadians everything they wanted: protection for their Catholic faith, their French language, their own laws. Meanwhile, they're looking south at the American revolutionaries, a lot of whom were from New England and were, well, let's just say, not big fans of Catholics. For the Quebecois, joining the Americans looked like a really bad deal.
And the invasion itself? It was an absolute catastrophe. I mean, just to give you an idea, Benedict Arnold's march to Quebec City was a nightmare. His soldiers were freezing, they were starving. It got so bad they were literally boiling and eating their own leather shoes and cartridge boxes just to survive. They showed up to the fight completely spent and were easily beaten.
Now you'd think after a disaster like that, they'd learn their lesson. But nope. Which brings us to round two, the most famous attempt, the War of 1812. And this wasn't just a minor border fight. This was the big one. This was America's all-out effort to finally make Canada part of the US.
This quote from Thomas Jefferson just perfectly sums up the thinking in Washington at the time. They were so overconfident. They saw that Britain was totally bogged down fighting Napoleon over in Europe, and they thought Canada was just ripe for the picking. They seriously believed their militias could just stroll in and it'd be over in a few weeks. But here's where that expectation just slammed into a wall of reality. The Americans expected to be welcomed as liberators. Instead, Canadian militias and their Indigenous allies fought like lions right alongside the British troops to defend their homes. That quick little war America was planning, it turned into a bloody, 2-year-long slugfest.
The war kicked off with maybe one of the most embarrassing moments in the history of the US military. The American general who was supposed to be invading Canada, well, he completely panicked, retreated, and then surrendered the entire city of Detroit to a smaller British and Indigenous force, and get this, he did it without a single real battle being fought, just gave it away.
And the humiliation just kept coming. After American troops went and burned the Parliament buildings in York, which is now Toronto, the British decided it was payback time. They sailed right up the Chesapeake Bay, marched straight into Washington, D.C., and burned down the U.S. Capitol building and the White House.
So here's the most important takeaway from that whole war. On paper, it was a draw. Nobody really won. No territory changed hands. But for Canada, it was a massive psychological victory. For the first time ever, you had French Canadians, British Loyalists, and Indigenous peoples all fighting together against a common enemy. And from that point on, resisting America became a huge part of what it meant to be Canadian.
So 2 failed invasions. You'd think that would be it, right? But the story wasn't over. Throughout the 1800s, the threat of an American takeover was always there, simmering in the background. And the crazy part, the paradox, is that this constant pressure is actually what forced the scattered Canadian colonies to finally become a single country.
And the source of all that pressure was this idea called manifest destiny. It was this hugely popular belief in the US that America had a God-given right to expand and control the whole continent, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And for a whole lot of Americans, the whole continent definitely included Canada.
And this wasn't just some abstract idea. I mean, US politicians talked about annexing Canada all the time. But the wildest threat came from something called the Fenian Raids. Get this, these were groups of Irish-American veterans from the Civil War who literally launched armed invasions into Canada. Their plan was to capture Canada and basically hold it ransom, trade it back to Britain in exchange for Ireland's freedom. It sounds crazy, but it was real.
And you can just see how all this led to one thing. You've got this constant fear of America. Then the Fenian Raids happen, and it proves to everyone that the threat isn't just talk, it's real. So all these separate little British colonies in North America finally look at each other and realize, hey, we're too weak on our own. If we don't band together, we're going to get picked off one by one. And so, to defend themselves against the United States, they united. In 1867, the Dominion of Canada was born.
So after all that fighting, all that pressure, what's the final verdict? Why is there a Canada today? Well, it really comes down to a whole mix of reasons from both sides of the border and from across the ocean.
When you really boil it all down, it's a three-part story. First, you have the Canadians themselves, who actively fought back and started to build their own unique identity. Then you have Great Britain, which provided the military muscle and political savvy to keep the colonies loyal. And finally, you have the United States, which, after failing over and over, eventually just decided that expanding west into empty land was a whole lot easier and cheaper than fighting their way north.
And that leads us to the big, fascinating final question. What if? What if it all went the other way? What if Thomas Jefferson was right and taking Canada was just a mere matter of marching? How different would North America and the world look today? Just think about it for a second. The U.S. would control an insane amount of natural resources, all that oil, all that fresh water. American politics would probably be completely different, likely much more progressive, with the addition of all those Canadian provinces as new states. And maybe saddest of all, the world would have lost that unique Canadian culture, the one that gave us everything from hockey and poutine to comedians like Jim Carrey and Seth Rogen.
So the next time you look at that long, famously peaceful border, just remember, it wasn't a given. It wasn't an accident. Canada's existence was forged in fire and conflict. That history is the reason we have two nations in North America, not just one. It's proof that sometimes good fences really do make good neighbors, especially when you had to fight to build them.